Okay.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our session. We're going to be working, finishing on old world today, Spain, a little bit about Portugal and Germany. And these are the last few main wine growers, wine producers in the old world. So we're going to discuss that. And I don't know if you can see this photo very well, but it's actually a picture of what we call a library. Many wineries around the world, especially ones that have been producing wine for a long period of time, have these wineries. And what they are is there's different compartments. And in the different compartments, they have wine stored. And each one of these compartments represents a year in their harvest, a vintage. And they have the dates of the vintages above all of that. And it basically is their library. It is their history of the wines that they've been producing over the years. And in this particular photo, you can see that the bottles are covered in a heavy layer of dust, and there's lots of colors over them, which show that these bottles have been there a long period of time. Has a history of aging their wines before they sell them. Most of the wines that we get are really that are available for sale are really within a year or two of when the grapes have been harvested. But in Spain, they have this history of sort of aging the wines for a period of time before they actually let them leave the winery and go into the market. This is another good example of Spain. You can definitely see it, but the grapes have been, there's a term called trained, which means that the grapevines have been placed in such a way that they sit very, very high in the vineyard on these tall concrete posts. And what this does is it puts the canopy very, very high in the vineyard, probably about this height. And then all of the space from, say, our neck down is open. And why this is beneficial, because Spain is a very, very hot country. It's quite far south. It's more south than France because it's further down than France. So it's much more southern, it's much warmer. So by having these vineyards where they train the grapes up high like this, area underneath is open. So actually the breezes can come through and cool down the vineyard. So it's another method that the winemaker can make his vineyard a little more conducive for growing quality grapes.
Good morning, Mr. Keith Edgar. I'm so sorry. I was having a little bit of internet connectivity issues, so just was flickering in a while. Nice to see you back, no, Mr. Keith Edgar.
No problem. We're just kind of getting started.
That's great, sir. Yes, sir. So I will be getting in touch with all my students, and I will park all the questions at the end of the session in the chat box. Yeah.
Great, super. So let's get on with Spain then. So Spain has this tradition of aging the wines before they sell them, and this aging can happen in the bottle, but primarily they actually like to age it in the oak barrels. And aging wine in oak barrels lends some character to the wine. It gives this sort of oaky character. It gives the aromas and flavors of coconut and very, very earthy characters, which kind of makes Spanish wines a little bit unique in its character because they have this extended aging, especially when we get to Rioja, which is one of the two famous areas within Spain. And we're actually going to get a little more specific into Rioja and the methods that they use in their wine production. I used to drink a lot of Spanish wine when I was younger, because when I was just learning about wine, I would go to the wine shops and I would buy wine that I would like to try. And I didn't know a lot about wine at the time, but one of the things that I did sort of know or I'd heard that wine tends to be better if it's aged. It's a little bit older. So I would often go to the wine shop and I would look through the different wines that were available. And I ended up buying a lot of Spanish wines because I could see that they were actually older vintages than any of the other wines that Spanish wines, Spain wanting to age their wines before they're sold. So you can, even today, if you're in India, you can go to the local wine shop, the good ones, not the sort of the little mom and pop ones that you see, the little tiny ones with the bars across it, but the bigger, more. And if you go to the India section, you're going to be drinking 2019, 2018, 2019 vintages, pretty much across the board, even in France and in America, very only 2 or 3 years old. But if you go to the Spanish section in the wine shop, you're going to see these Spanish wines, which are available maybe 2010, 2015. You're going to see these older vintages. And it's not because they've been sitting on the shelf in Spencer's for that long a period of time. It's because these wines were aged in the winery before they've been released to the public. So it is actually a great opportunity to be able to taste older wines. They tend to cost a little bit more because, again, there's that you've been keeping your product not for sale for a few years, so you have to get some recoup on that. So they tend to be a little bit more expensive, but there's some unique character that you get in an aged wine that you just don't get in a younger wine. So Spain has about 2.9 million acres of grapes being grown in that country, which is the largest area devoted for grapes in all of Europe. It's more acreage than France and Italy, but it is only the third largest producer. So the amount of grapes that they take off per acre is less than France and Italy. And that's, we refer to something called the yield. The yield of grapes is less, but that actually, the lower the yield, gives a little bit better quality of grapes. So Spain, lots and lots of plantings everywhere, but the yield of the grapes is less, but they are the third. France, Italy, and then Spain is the third largest producer in the world. Like Italy, remember we talked about Italy, and Italy has 1,000 different grape varieties, which is a lot of grape varieties. Spain has a lot as well. More than France, but not quite as many as Italy. It has only about 400 grape varieties. But the vast majority of all the wine that is produced in Spain comes from just 20 grape varieties. And you can probably look at the entire world the same way. There's probably a couple of thousand different grape varieties throughout the world, but the vast majority of all the wine that is produced in the world is coming from probably 20 grape varieties only. So in Spain, it's very famous for its fortified wine of sherry. And I know Peter's going to be doing a session for you on fortified wines. He's going to talk about port, sherry, and the different fortified wines, how those are done. Spain also has a very, very beautiful sparkling wine that they call cava. And cava can be made in the same method as the method champenois, which is the French method. So I'm actually a big fan of cava, the sparkling wine from Spain. I think it's a little bit more interesting than the sparkling wines coming out of Italy. So it's a nice thing. But they make a lot, and they drink a lot of cava in Spain. This is a map of Spain. As you can see, the wine growing regions are actually a little bit spaced out. We saw in Italy, remember, right from the top of Italy to the bottom, there was the wine regions all together. But in Spain, there is some separation of them. You do see a lot of the wine regions near the coast. And again, because Spain is so far south, it's very hot. And by having these vineyards along the coast, the cooling breezes that are coming in off the sea help to moderate all of that heat. But you'll find within the center of Spain, you don't see as many of the wine growing regions. And when you do see them, they are actually higher up in elevation. So it's much cooler. You can see here Ribera d'Oro, Rioja, and Navarra. They are actually quite a bit high in elevation, with the exception of La Mancha. And there's a very, very large wine region in the middle of Spain called La Mancha. And it is quite hot there, which the heat does allow you to grow tons and tons of grapes, but the quality of this is always going to be less area that's more moderate. Rioja is actually quite famous in the world for being the place that grows huge amounts of wine, but very, very low quality, but also very, very inexpensive. Some of the cheapest wine produced in the world is coming from La Mancha. Tons and tons. So it's a big commercial hub where they produce a ton of low quality wines, but they're also very, very inexpensive. You can buy a bottle of wine from the winery there for 50 rupees, really. But by the time it gets to the market, they're charging more than that. But it is one of the cheapest places in the world to purchase wine, La Mancha. And you can see down here at the bottom, this is Jerez, and Jerez is the home to sherry, that fortified wine, which is very, very famous, which you're going to be learning more about from Peter. And we're going to be talking about, we're going to go a little bit more in depth in only 2 different regions. And these are the top regions in Spain. We have Rioja, which is here near the top. And there's a very small one here called Priorat. But Priorat and Rioja produce Spain's most famous wine. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on those 2 regions. And then we also have a little area over here right on the coast called Rías Baixas. And Rías Baixas produces a very famous white of the Albarino grape. And again, we talked about some of the white wine that was being produced in Italy along the coast. It was also using the Albarino grape. They do this here, and it's a beautiful white wine. Again, that goes really well with fresh fish and seafood. And again, if you see it, this wine region is right along the coast. And understanding that concept of what grows together goes together, most of the food that is being consumed in that area, because they're right on the coast, is fresh fish and seafood. So the wines of that region need to complement the food that is typically produced in that region. So where you have a coastal region, you're going to see a lot more white wine being produced, because white wine and fresh fish and seafood just go better together. So remember that what grows together goes together when you start doing your wine and food pairing stuff. So let's talk about some of the labeling terms. And labeling terms are really important because it tells us a lot about the wine just by reading the label, so we actually don't have to drink it, because we can't drink every wine to be able to understand what the wine is like. But by looking at the label, we can understand the terms. And because Spain has this history of aging their wines before they sell them, they have label terms specifically to note aging and periods of aging. So label terms, we have Crianza, Reserva, and Gran Reserva. If you see Crianza on the label, it means that this wine has been aged for at least 2 years before it can be sold. It needs to be a minimum of 6 months in oak barrel, and the rest can be in bottle. These are the minimums. Reserva on the label is going to tell us that this wine has been aged for 3 years before it's been went out of the winery. And of those 3 years, at least 1 year needs to be in oak barrel. And again, the longer that we age wine in oak barrel, the more of these barrel aging characteristics we're going to find in the wine, this oakiness, this sweet coconut, and as they extend the age, we start to get a more earthy character to the wine. And this is what we're going to find in Gran Reserva. So if you see Gran Reserva on the label, 5 years is the minimum that this wine can be aged before it's sold. And of these 5 years, a year and a half, 18 months must be in oak barrel. And these wines, the character of this is quite interesting. And we're going to get to that in a second. Joven, it's spelled Joven, but in Spain, they don't pronounce J as a J, they pronounce the J as an H. So Joven, if you see Joven on the label, Joven basically means young. So Joven means no oak aging at all. Then the classification system that Spain has is the DO system. And at the very top of the DO system is their DOC. And DOC is only Rioja and Priorat. These are the only two regions that get this high designation of DOC. And then it goes down the line. And then they also have at the very bottom, they have their VDM, which is Vino de Mesa, or their table wine, their simple wines. So today we're just going to focus on the two DOC regions, Rioja and Priorat. And we're going to learn a little bit more about those regions. Grape varieties, again, there's 400 different grape varieties in Spain. We just want to focus on 4. How's that? I only have to learn 4. For black grapes, we have Tempranillo. Tempranillo is really for these beautiful, full-bodied red wines. Medium acidity, they have flavors of strawberry, and it's often blended with our Garnache. Garnache is the other grape of Spain, the main grape of Spain. It has higher alcohol, but it has a spiciness, and it has lighter tannin. Lower quality wines will have a higher percentage of Garnache. Higher quality wines will have a higher percentage of Tempranillo. And in Spain, they really like to blend their grapes, especially when dealing with red wine. You'll often find many different grapes have been blended together to make the final product in Spain. In white grapes, 2 very important grapes to understand. One is Erin, and the second is this Albarino that I was talking about that's coming from the coastal region of Rías Baixas. Albarino creates this really nice, light, medium-bodied wine, citrus fruit flavors, high acidity, really, really beautiful, especially on a hot summer day. There's nothing better than drinking a nice glass of Albarino. Erin, on the other hand, is a very interesting grape. It is actually the most planted grape in all of Spain. And I read somewhere that it might be the most planted grape definitely in Spain. But you'll rarely find a wine made of Erin, because all of the Erin grapes, the wine that is made from these grapes is then converted into brandy. So that it's made into wine, but then it's distilled into brandy. And the Spanish brandy business is very, very big, especially within Spain, especially within Europe. The consumption of Spanish brandy is huge. And it's significantly less expensive than the French brandies, which are just across the border up into France in Cognac region. But they produce a ton of it. But it is primarily coming from this Erin grape. And this Erin grape is primarily produced in that La Mancha area, where they produce tons and tons and tons of it. But it is then made into wine and then distilled into brandy. So let's talk a little bit about Rioja. I love Rioja wines, again, because I've been drinking them for a long, long time. We did our wine tour to Rioja a few years back. It is Spain's famous wine region for red wines. Again, the main grapes used in Rioja are the Tempranillo and the Garnache. But much of the character of Rioja wines doesn't come from the grapes. It comes from this extended aging in oak barrels. And that's what's very unique about Rioja wines. There's a lot of oak aging that's going on in these wines, especially in these reservas and the Gran Reservas. And what aging that helps to tannins, which it out but it gives this sweet and vanilla. And then again, with aging in oak barrels, especially in reservas, we're getting these more savory characters, animal, vegetal, leather, mushrooms, very sort of unique earthy character that we're getting from just leaving these wines, these oak barrel periods of 3 years and up. And what makes it, even though it is inland, which typically inland in Spain is going to be quite hot, but because it's quite high in elevation, it's a more moderate climate. In fact, the climate of Rioja is actually very similar to the climate of Bordeaux, which is a little bit further north from it, right across the border. It has what we call a continental climate, so it's a little more moderate than some of the other areas in Spain. And when we actually were visiting Spain, we started off in Priorat, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. We were there for one day, and then the next day, we got in our cars and we drove up to Rioja, and it took about 4 hours, higher and higher, and the temperature fell quite a bit, because when we were in Priorat, at nighttime, Priorat, just a 4 hours drive, or sorry, Rioja, 4 hours later, at nighttime, we actually had to wear a jacket, a light jacket, because the temperature had changed so much, which says a lot about the differences between the wine regions. But Rioja is quite high in elevation and just a much more moderate climate, but it's really, really good for producing grapes for red wine, and especially this Tempranillo and the Garnache that it's famous for. So Priorat is the other region in Spain that is producing extremely high quality, big, powerful wines. Priorat has a very interesting history. Priorat has been making wines for almost 1,000 years that we know of. And it was producing, and that was kind of all that it did, because the area of Priorat is actually kind of up in the mountains. It's very, very steep, and the soil that's there is mostly rocky, and it doesn't really lend itself for growing anything other than grapes and olives. There's no other farms there. There's no place to have wheat or vegetables or any of that. So this area was very unique because it was just for growing grapes and olives. And it started by the monasteries back then, again, about 1163 AD. So we were able to, that's where they have the history going back to. But what happened was, in the late 1800s, the area was attacked by Phylloxera. And I don't know if we've really discussed Phylloxera yet, but Phylloxera is a pest, and it's a small little bug. And what happens is this bug eats away at the roots of grapevines and causes them to get very, very sick, and after a while they'll die. And this bug was actually discovered in America and was brought to England by some botanists, which are scientists that study plants, because they were visiting, these English botanists were visiting the United States, and they saw these new grape varieties that they had never seen before. So what they did is they brought them back. This is around the mid 1800s. They brought these grapevines back to London, to the UK, and they dug them up and they put these burlap bags around the root ball with the soil and the roots, brought them on the ship and took them back, and they planted them in the gardens in the UK. And people would come and say, oh, isn't this really interesting, these new grape varieties we've never seen before. What they didn't realize was there was this tiny bug that came along for the ride. And this bug, again, there's two different kinds of grapes. There's Vitis vinifera, which is the grapes that we use for wine, Chardonnay, Cabernet, Merlot, etc. And then there's Vitis lubrasca. And Vitis lubrasca is table grapes. These are the larger grapes that we eat. Most of the grapes that are grown in India that you find in the markets or this Vitis lubrusca. They're slightly different because of their genus species. And this Vitis lubrusca that was growing in the United States, this was a kind of grape that they'd never seen before, that they brought to the, and what this Phylloxera, this little bug, the Vitis lubrusca was actually a little bit immune to these bugs. So even though the bugs were eating away at the roots of the Vitis lubrusca, they weren't killing the plant. The plant had learned to survive. So Vitis lubrusca was protected against these bugs. But Vitis vinifera, the grape of wine, is not. In fact, the bugs, these vines were destroyed by these bugs. And it sort of started in the United States, but then as they were moving, there's a lot of trade in grapes, the plants. And someone had taken some of the plants from the UK, they brought them into France, France down into Spain, Spain into Italy. So they were moving these grape varieties around. And what was happening is this little bug, Phylloxera, was going along for the ride. And this bug ended up infecting all of the vineyards all over the world, with the exception of Chile and Argentina. But everywhere else in the world, these bugs came and started to damage and destroy all of the grapes. In fact, the big Phylloxera epidemic in France killed off about 80–90% of all of the vines that there was. So it was a big, big disaster. So what they had discovered to do to protect how they could continue to make wine is all of the grapes around the world, with exception of Chile and Argentina, they have the root system of the Vitis lubrusca, which is protected, it can protect itself against the Phylloxera, but the top of the vine is grafted from Vitis vinifera. So you actually have Vitis lubrusca and Vitis vinifera together in all of the vineyards all over the world. And they're grafted. And if you look down near the bottom of the plant, you can see where they've actually taken the root, they make a little cut, and they put the Vitis vinifera vine on the top, and that comes together and makes, so that's how we can grow all of this Chardonnay.
Mr. Edgar, I'm sorry to interrupt you in the middle.
Cabernet, all of the Vitis vinifera. Yeah.
Mr. Bhaskar, probably during the initial stage of their second year wine sessions regarding the Phylloxera and the grafting.
Oh, he did it. Okay.
Yes, he did a little bit of fair bit of explanation to them. Yes, so I'm sure that they will be aware of the scion and the rootstock stuff, right?
Great, super. I'm glad you got it. But what happened in Priorat was because the only thing that really grew up in these mountains was grapes and olives. So because of the Phylloxera epidemic, not only did it kill all the grapes, it actually killed the entire economy. So everyone left this area. So Priorat was pretty much desolate of everything and everybody, because there was nothing, no other business you could do there. So, but there was a group of students, wine students from Barcelona, and they used to come out on the weekends, and they would stay in some of these old farmhouses that were around that area. And they would come out on the weekends and they would drink and they would party and they would do all sorts of crazy stuff. And one of them had noticed out the window one day of the place where they were staying, and they said, "That looks like a grapevine." So they went and they looked at it. And what happens with Phylloxera, sometimes it doesn't completely kill the grape, very, very weak, so that it can't produce very many grapes at all, profitable. And they had sort of rediscovered this area as a place to grow grapes. So what they did is they started to experiment a bit. They were using the grapes that are kind of native for that nearby that, and those are grapes which, but they also, because they were a little bit more modern thinking, these students, is that they also brought in some French grapes, the Cabernet, the Merlot, and the Syrah. So they were growing all of these grapes, and they were blending them together to make wine. And there was a group of them, and there was a group of sort of 5 friends that sort of started all this. And they all made wine together, but they did it under 5 different labels. And when they made these wines, and then when they submitted them to these international competitions, which is what a lot of people do to try and promote their wines, one of them had won a best wine in the world. So this particular area, even though it had been neglected for a number of years, or a century, was really, really good at growing grapes. Once they had, regraphed, became very, very popular. And again, it was only about 4,500 acres of grapes at the time. And now we are on to many, much bigger there. There's about 100 different wineries there. A lot of big international wine companies are coming in growing grapes, producing phenomenal, beautiful, big, kind of interesting, the story of it, because it was, again, it has a history going back 1,000 years of growing grapes, but it was completely left alone for about 100 years before it was rediscovered. And then in the rediscovery, by adding some of the French grapes, again, a little bit of the concept of super Tuscan wines in Italy, native grapes and wine. So it's a really interesting story, pre-run. And we visited there as a wine tour, so I'm a big fan of the wines. So that's Spain. Again, Rioja, Priorat, the 2 most famous areas there. Now we're going to talk quickly a little bit about Portugal. Portugal, you can see very terraced areas. A lot of here, again, you see grapes growing on hills. Old producer of wine, again, Portugal. At the top, we have Vinho Verde, and Vinho Verde is actually a very famous wine. It's Verde means green, so young wine. So this Vinho Verde, this white wine that's produced there, is quite famous, and it actually has a little bit of a spritz. It's not sparkling, but the wine has a slight spritziness to it. And it's a very refreshing and also a very good fish and seafood wine. And we have here the city of Porto, and that is what gave port wine its fame. But the wine of Port is actually produced, is grown up here in the Douro Valley. And the Douro Valley is the most famous wine growing region in all of Portugal, primarily because of port wine. All of the grapes are growing up there to make port. But nowadays they're actually, because port consumption itself has gotten less and less and less over the years, because people just aren't drinking this wine after dinner anymore. They're not really into it. So what a lot of these wineries are doing, instead of making port wine, they're starting to make regular wine, like still wine, out of the same grape varieties from the same vineyards that they were using to make port, but they're making just a regular red wine. And these wines have now become very, very popular. These are very, very popular wines. We're starting to see them coming up in very trendy restaurants, wine shops, etc. So vineyards all over Portugal, kind of everywhere in Portugal, you're going to find vineyards. Again, the Vinho Verde, this slightly effervescent white wine, unoaked, kind of low alcohol. And again, the most famous region for red wines is the Douro Valley. Portugal has quite a long list of its native grape varieties, but the most famous grape that they produce there is called Touriga Nacional. Again, Portugal obviously is famous for its production of the sweet port wine. And Portugal also makes its own sparkling wine, and they label it as espumante. So if you see espumante on the label, you know it's a sparkling wine from Portugal. Portugal has its own classification system. In fact, it has been around longer than any other classification system in the world. Portugal has the oldest system, dating back about 200 plus years. They have DOC, which is their highest, IPR, Vino Regional, and then at the bottom, they also have their Vino de Mesa or table wines. Okay, just a few little hits on Portugal. There's a lot more to learn and a lot of wines there, but we're just going to hit it a little bit. Now we're going to talk about Germany. And Germany, and this photo in general, I think is really interesting to understand the effects of terroir on producing wine. Because Germany is very, very far north. It is one of the coolest wine growing areas in all of Europe. And if you remember when we talked about terroir, what you need to have in the vineyard in order to get your grapes to ripen in a cooler climate or a climate that is very far north, you need to have a south-facing slope. And it helps if you've got a large body of water, this river, that the sunlight will come down, hit the body of water, and bounce into the vineyard. So this is a really perfect example of what you need to be able to get your grapes to ripen in Germany. In fact, if we look at the map of Germany, the majority of the wine that is produced there is here in the the southwest, and all of the vineyards are around the Rhine River and its other little rivers that come together. So if you're going to Germany and you're going to visit the wineries there, they are all on slopes and they are all around the river. That is the terroir that's required when you're that far north, and the weather is just quite a bit cooler, cool climate weather. So you really need to have that. But you can see the rest of Germany here. It stretches all the way to Denmark. So we're getting very, very far up here. No wine can be grown here because it's just too cold, too cool in the summer, not enough days of sunlight. Again, so it's just down here we're going to find it, just really a small part of the country. Again, all around the river, and again, as far south as you can go. And in Germany, they also focus on just a handful of grapes that can ripen in a cooler climate. Germany is the 8th largest producer of wine in the world, which is actually a fair amount. They produce about 1.3 billion bottles of wine. That's a lot of wine. But the range of the wines that are produced in Germany is quite vast. There's some very, very simple, very, very inexpensive sweet wines, all the way up to some very, very high quality, typically Riesling grapes. This is because Riesling is the grape that can ripen, I think, in around 90 days, where Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, for example, and Syrah, they require about 120, 130 days to ripen. And they just don't have that many days because they're so far north of sunshine and the temperature that they need to get it. So the only grapes that are really used are Riesling and Pinot Noir, because again, Pinot Noir is a cool climate grape. It does produce there quite well. So again, primarily along the Rhine River, white wine, again, white grapes ripen sooner than black grapes. So 2/3 of the wine that is being produced in Germany is white wine. Has only about 1/10 the vineyards that you're going to find in France, Italy, and Spain, quite a bit less. Again, mixed reputation internationally. Interesting enough, sommeliers around the world are really into very, very high quality Rieslings coming from Germany. This is the new kind of sexy for sommeliers, because they do produce in Germany these really, really beautiful Rieslings. Very, very intense, very, very aromatic, very, very delicious wine. But Germany actually has more of a reputation of producing very cheap, very sweet, low quality wines. Liebfraumilch. And in college, we drank a lot of Liebfraumilch because it's a little bit sweet and it's cheap. And I think it's actually coming into India now. You're starting to see like Blue Nun is another wine that we used to drink as well. And people are drinking it in India thinking it's really fancy, but it's really very low quality. But it's very popular, and they sell millions and millions and millions of bottles of Liebfraumilch. The same with Blue Nun, millions of it, because it sort of gets a wine consumer. Someone's discovering wines, and we always found people that are just learning about wine prefer their wines to be a little bit sweet. And Germany is exactly that. This little bit sweet, not too complicated, very inexpensive wine, and it sort of gets people to discover wine with that. But again, huge quality differences in wine in Germany. Again, primarily white wine, using a lot of Riesling, but red wine production has surged in the last 10, 20 years, actually being fueled by the domestic demand. The Germans love to drink their own wine. So they wanted to be able to drink more red wine. So you started to see a growth in the production of Pinot Noir. Again, Pinot Noir is a cool climate grape that will ripen and produce quality wines in cooler wine growing regions. The German name, because if you look at the label in Germany, it's not going to say Pinot Noir, it'll say Spätburgunder. And Spätburgunder is the German word for Pinot Noir. So where you see Spätburgunder, so organized, they're very, very structured. You know, they make very good cars like the Mercedes-Benz. Germany likes to organize, structure, everything has to have a place. And they love to do this with their wines as well. Wine labels from Germany are the most detailed wine labels in the world. And they have their classification system as well. Land wine is their version of table wine, kind of the simple wine. And then they have the next level of Qualitätswein. Then they have Qualitätswein mit Predicate. And then there's the different categories of predicate wine, which we'll get to. And then they have, they'll also put on the label the levels of sweetness. From Trocken, which means dry, to Halbtrocken, half dry, Classic, Feinherb, again, this is kind of medium sweetness, Lieblich, down to Suisse. Suisse is the sweetest wine. So if we look at the different classifications of the predicate wines, you'll see, and again, this is all going to be on the label. There's Cabernet, Spätlese, Auslese, Beerenauslese, Trockenbeerenauslese, and Eiswein. So Cabernet, this is the driest wine. And again, these are all in regards to the level of sweetness that are in the grape. So cabinet is basically regular ripeness picked on the vine as it's ripened. Spätlese means late harvest. So they let the grapes stay on the vine a little bit longer in the vineyard in order to get full ripeness of the grapes. And then Auslese is select harvest, where they'll actually go in and they'll pick just the very, very ripe grapes. Some grapes actually have gotten a little bit of the noble rot. They've started to shrivel up a little bit. And then Barren Auslese, they actually go in and they pick berries out of the clusters that have gotten all nice and raisiny and they've dried up. So you're getting a very, very high concentration of sugar in the this is Trockenbeeren Os, and these are basically dried berries. And these, again, once they're dried, instead of 20% sugars, they've got 80% sugars and 20% water. So they're starting off with a very, very, very sweet. And this is where we get some very, very beautiful sweet wines, just from Germany. And again, they produce ice wine, which is where the grapes have been frozen on the vine, doing that. And I don't know if any of the interview I did with Donald Zeraldo, Canada. Canada also produces a very good ice wine there as well. Again, a much cooler climate. Grape varieties are going to be different there. They want to have these cool climate grapes, Riesling, Pinot Noir. Spain is almost the complete opposite of Germany, quite warm there. So they actually do things to make the grapes a little more healthy in the vineyard, as I said, by training them up so the breezes can go through. Higher elevation in Rioja, where they can keep the grapes a little more moderate temperature. So that is a little bit about Spain, Portugal, and Germany. So if we have any questions.
Hey,
I would be more.
yes, Mr. Edgar, we have a few questions today. One of the students, Sinchan, would love to know what is the concept of frozen grapes, and how it is actually, is helping to have the signature German wines. How the frozen grapes are processed into making of this German wines.
Again, to make a sweet wine, you need to start off with very, very high levels of sugar in your grape juice. Going back, this will ripen 80% water, 20% sugars, and the things that make grapes taste like grapes. In the Trockenbeeren Auslese, they allow them to dry out so that you reduce the water that way. And when you squeeze, you're basically squeezing raisins to get this very, very high concentration sugar grape juice. In ice wine, instead of letting the grapes dry out, what you do is you allow the ice crystals to separate the water juice, because 80% water, 20% sugars, and things that make grapes taste like grapes. This 20% freezes at a much lower temperature than the water does, the H2O that's in the grape juice. So the H2O freezes at about -8 Celsius. And at -8 Celsius, the majority of the water is in ice crystals. But the syrup, this sweet essence of grapes, is still in liquid form. So they pick the grapes when they're frozen, and then they press them. And again, they can only press them so much because the ice is solid. But when you press them a little bit, just the nectar, the juice of the grape can come out. It's very, very high levels of sugar. And then the water is encapsulated in ice crystals. So it doesn't move because it's ice, but this other 20% that doesn't freeze or freezes at a much lower temperature is allowed to come out of the grape. And then you now have very, very high levels of sugar in the grape juice, and this is now made into ice wine. So that's how we use it that way.
Right, that's lovely. I'm sure the students have really managed to understand the concept of the frozen grapes and how it is processed for ice wines. Okay, the next question goes, Mr. Edgar. They would like to know, as it is told that the wine inherits a smoky flavor which is coming out of the oak, but how does the other flavors dominate over smokiness, like ripe berries and rich fruits? How does that flavor inherit? Is it only coming from other reason?
No, well, again, there's different flavors in wine. If there are certain flavors that come from the grapes themselves. So the berry flavors, the strawberry, blackberry, cherry, for red wines, for white wines, lemon, lime, citrus, passion fruit, tropical fruit. These are all flavors that come from the grapes. So when we make wine from the grapes, we have our wine, but now we take that and we put it into the oak barrels for aging. And when you put the wine in the oak barrels for an extended period of time, now the oak is going to influence the flavors. So aging in oak will give more of an oaky, there's not so much like smoke flavor, but you get more of an oakiness. You get sweet coconut flavors, you get vanilla. And again, vanilla is a component of oak. It is a component in oak called vanillin. And when the wine is in the oak barrel, it actually goes in and out of the pores of the oak. So the wine goes into the wood, out, into the wood, out. And as it goes in and out, it's pulling out the components of the oak. And that's where we get the oakiness, the vanilla, the sweet coconut flavors. And again, extended aging in oak is going to give you these mushroomy, meaty, leather flavors and aromas. So there's a separation of the flavors in the wine. The berries is coming from the grapes themselves, those flavors. And then the other flavors are coming from the oak aging itself.
Okay. Another question which is coming, what are the unique specialities of Rioja, which is making different from other areas, regions of Spain?
Again, Rioja is because they have extended aging in oak. Often throughout the world, you'll find them aging oak maybe 6 months, maybe a year in oak barrels. But in Rioja, they will do it for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, or longer in oak. And this is not specifically unique to Rioja, but much more wine ages, oak aging, and it's just kind of something that they've been doing for a long because of that. So because extended aging that we see in more, and in other areas it's sort of. Another question?
That's all, Mr. Edgar, so far from the students' perspective, and we look forward again to connect once again with you in this very exciting session, Mr. Edgar. And on behalf of IIHM fraternity, we wish you all the best. Good luck, stay safe. And the students are missing that live interactions, and when you walk around in the middle of the class, and the real wine appreciation. And I'm hoping probably they will come back to see these days very soon. Thank you so much, Mr. Edgar.
No problem. We'll see you next time.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Edgar. Thank you so much, students. Bye-bye.